several years now and have seen more than you can imagine. From city council races to congressional campaigns, I've done my fair share of media appearances, op-ed writing, and on-the-record experience. Normally, I'm writing words for other people, but this year, you'll be hearing directly from me. I'm starting a new podcast called Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, where we're going to talk to real people to see how this election's messaging is being received and where it's lacking. I hope you'll join me on this new adventure by following Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Hello, hello, hello. Those of you who have been watching us for a while know that that was the season 1 promotional video. That was what I put out to launch, that I was coming out with a podcast and that I wanted people to tune in and watch it. And here we are a year later, a year to the day. So September 30th, 2020, I launched that in order to talk about the 2020 elections. And in season 2, we did the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. Unfortunately, I had a pretty significant injury that cut that season short. So I was not able to end it the way I would like. And because of that, I wanted to kick this off sort of to wrap that up. So today we are giving the Biden-Harris administration their report card, right? We're somewhat grading them on how they've done thus far. A lot has changed. A lot has changed since I left you all. So the last time I was live, we were fresh off the insurrection. Remember that? That definitely happened. We were sort of in a gray area of administrations. We didn't know if Trump was going to be impeached. We didn't know what would happen if he was. We didn't know if Biden was going to be able to take office on January 20th. But all of that has since come into fruition, and we are currently living under the Biden-Harris administration. And as we remember, they inherited like quite a lot of issues. We were talking about immigration problems. We were talking about a pretty major infrastructure crisis. We were talking about a legitimation issue, right? Meaning that like there was a solid portion of the electorate, or so it felt, believed that he was not the president and that there had been a rigging of the election. And so with all of that coming in as an administration, there was so much that we were looking for and looking forward to. And so here we are, we sit in September of this administration with it kicking off in January. So roughly 8 months. And there's also been a lot that's happened there. And so I'm excited to talk to you tonight about how everything is going. There are some of my favorite people here to join me to talk about these varying things. And I kind of want to kick it off with a couple different ideas. The first thought is that if you have any questions or any suggestions, as you know, please put them in the chat. I'll gladly answer any questions that come through there in the comments. But until then, I've kind of got the top agenda items that we're going over, and we're going to go ahead and start. So today, a major topic, the vote was supposed to be today, was on the infrastructure bill. Which, as we know, infrastructure has been a hot topic, particularly for this administration. There's been a big price tag put on this infrastructure bill, and part of the tension around it has been that this administration's bill included things that we have not seen previously included in other infrastructure bills. And so I don't want to give much more away than that, because I do have one of my favorite people coming to talk on about it. Today, we're going to talk to Jarrell Cook about infrastructure. You might remember him from season 1. He went over one of the presidential debates with us, but he's going to kind of talk through what makes this infrastructure bill different and who's for it, who's against it, and what all of it means for us. So I'd like to welcome for the second time to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, Jarrell Cook.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Jarrell. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me again. Congratulations on your podcast birthday.
Thank you. We can kind of start at the top. So what is in this infrastructure bill and what makes it different than previous bills?
Okay, so let me back up just a bit, because I think it's going to be important for understanding later. When folks are talking about the infrastructure bill, right? So there was the initial Biden plan that was released out in like March, where he sort of had this American jobs plan which was a very massive spending bill. None of that is what we're talking about today. We have two, I would say, competing or parallel infrastructure packages that are working through the system today. So we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then we also have the Reconciliation Act that includes a bunch of other infrastructure related issues in the budget. So that's framing, I think, some of the debate that's happening now. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a bill that was a sort of gut and amend out of a bill that was passed from the House into the Senate. They put into place a $1.2 trillion sort of hard, I think is the term that's being used, in a hard infrastructure package. And part of the sticking point in passing that for many of the progressives in the House and Senate was the commitment from Senate and House leadership to also dual track a $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill through the budget process that would include many of the hot items that progressives have been looking for, especially that sort of soft infrastructure like child tax credits and Pell Grants, things like that. So in the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package that is sitting in the House, waiting for, or that I think Speaker Pelosi is fighting to whip votes on as we speak. It's, like I said, it's $1.2 trillion. It's, I think, projected to add maybe $350 billion to the deficit over 10 years, but it includes important things like $110 billion for roads and bridges, $66 billion for railroads, $65 billion for power grid investments, as well as, I think, totaling something like 30 to 45 billion for environmental cleanup, things like closing oil and gas wells, as well as building infrastructure for electric vehicles, putting EV charging stations into place, switching school buses to electric school buses, things like that. We're also seeing money for public transportation, airports, money that's going to water infrastructure, which is very important, about 65 to $75 billion for that as well as some additional money for cybersecurity and climate change. So very much hard infrastructure jobs. And an important thing that I think is actually very interesting from an equity standpoint, $1 billion is directly meant to address reconnecting Black communities and disadvantaged communities that were disconnected from sort of larger transit infrastructure, sort of readdressing some of the issues that happened for redlining, during redlining, as well as, these sort of highway-induced white flight and infrastructure building that we had that destroyed Black communities, where they would zone out thriving Black community and put a highway over it. So some of that racial justice concerns have made it into the infrastructure package that way. Something that I thought was interesting, and that they're trying to address some of that in some of these road and bridges programs. So, but that's that hard infrastructure package. Right. And I think that's it's interesting because it's so closely tied to the $3.5 trillion package. And that package, I think, is that's much more reflective of Biden's Build Back Better plan.
Right.
So that has some of the sort of social commitments and spending for that we would want to see. And so that's including like a huge, I think it's $1.8 trillion to the finance committee to address things like a tax cut for Americans making under $400,000. That's where your wealth tax is, your corporate tax, the changes to the corporate tax rate are in there. I think it's almost $750 billion going to health, labor, education, and pensions. And that's where you're getting your child tax credit, your Pell Grants, the tuition-free community colleges. We're seeing money that is, I think, $330 billion for affordable housing, $135 million for wildfire emissions reduction, drought reduction. And then we're also seeing almost $200 billion meant to address clean energy.
Got you.
And I think,
so wait. So we're throwing out a lot of numbers,
yeah.
right? Out of curiosity, what's the timing on these numbers? Is this for 1 year? Is this for several years? Like how often are we going to like re-up this budget?
So
or this plan in particular?
Yes, I mean it'd be I mean it's all money spent over time. I mean there's certain so the difficulty here is that some of this money is, and some folks are jockeying to have it a commitment to spending it after certain like COVID funds are released. We're also seeing like for the reconciliation bill is authorizing other committees to spend money. And that can be, so when I'm saying, for example, and this will be relevant as we're talking about Joe Manchin later, 200 billion going to address clean energy. Well, that's actually $200 billion that's going to the Energy and Natural Resources Committee to develop a legislative proposal to spend that money. And that could extend as long as, I mean, they could have a 10-year program. They could have a program that starts spending in 2023. So that's everything is, it's the immediate spending, releasing of the funds, allocating it is immediate and for this year. But what those committees choose to do with those funds will be played out over time as they draft additional legislation, create programs, and each one of those will have its own contingency. And also, some money is going to go to federal agencies, and those agencies will determine their own spending programs, how they execute all of this in turn. So the money's immediate, but spending the money may take time.
That makes sense. Also keeping in mind that like I don't think anyone right now doubts that we need hard infrastructure, right? That like part of the issue is that because our freeway system was constructed kind of all at one time, it's sort of crumbling all at one time, right? I think most major cities in America, people are complaining about construction, people are complaining about potholes, people are complaining about issues. And so I think that Infrastructure Week was like a myth of the Trump administration, right? It was supposed to come, right? And it never showed up. And so Biden shows up and it's like, huzzah, here's your Infrastructure Week. And so I think that is an important thing to remember. And so what is the concern for the opposition, right? Like what are we opposed to here?
So and this is what I like to talk about. I think it's always wrong, no offense, always wrong to assume that that there's two sides, right? That opposition, people who are for it, people who are against it. Because here is a really good example where that's not true at all, right? You have different contingencies that want certain things. So they're for it to a certain extent, against it to a certain extent. And here there are multiple groups that are opposed, right? So, for example, you have the progressives who are opposed. And again, we're talking, unfortunately, about two different proposals, right? The Jobs Act and the Reconciliation Bill. Right. So you have progressives that are currently, I think, if folks are reading the news, will seem like they're in opposition. What they're opposed to is that they were promised as part of approving the Jobs Act that they would have the reconciliation bill considered either at the same time or very well soon after. What's happened recently is that there's been a push from the more moderate wing of the House, so the Blue Dog Coalition and the New Democrats, especially the Blue Dog Coalition, was pushing leadership to separate the votes, to have a vote on the $1.5 trillion Jobs Act package immediately, and then continue negotiations on the $3.5 trillion package. There was good reason to do that, in that there is not that significant agreement on the $3.5 trillion, but there is, as you noted, a lot of agreement, a lot of parties that have come together and found something they like in the $1.5 trillion. So I think the push was to get a quick win, still committed to doing something else later. That was not what the progressives were promised, and it's not what they agreed to when they agreed to vote to move this forward. So there's opposition there, right? Not because that they oppose anything, I think, that's substantively in this either infrastructure package, but that I think that there's some concern that they'll lose leverage if they pass the $1.5 trillion package. There'll be less incentive to give them what they're looking for on the $3.5 trillion package. In addition to that, there's certain poison pills, I might say, for progressives in that $3.5 trillion package. And I think they're trying to fight for some assurances that they can still fight for things like a Green New Deal or the equivalent of it, right? So they're not happy. So they're opposed. I think you still have the moderates that are not happy either, right? There's some opposition there in that the spending that's happening in the $3.5 trillion package, they're not fully comfortable with. They're not fully comfortable with changes in tax rates, things like that. But they are actually bringing in the support of a lot of labor unions, a lot of blue collar union work. But again, not all labor unions are in support. So we're seeing some cross friendly fire, I should say, across the lines. I would say you have certain special interest groups like the Environmentalists and the Sierra Club has come out as opposed, and they're influencing some Democrats to be in opposition. Again, not uniform amongst the environmental justice crowd or the environmentalist crowd, because I think the pro electric vehicle folks are very much in support of the measure. But I think Sierra Club's contention is that many of the provisions in both the Jobs Act or the Reconciliation Act, they don't go far enough. So they like it, but they don't like it enough. So they're encouraging people. So that's opposition, right? Obviously, there are Republicans who are opposed.
Sure.
They just would love to see it all fail.
Yeah.
And they're whipping votes actively to ensure that there are no House votes going towards either vote, especially not that vote. And then I think you have folks like specifically Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who are opposed for a variety of reasons. Sinema has on the record stated that her issue is with the taxation bits, not enough support for small businesses, things like that. You can take her at her word. I don't doubt people unless they give me a reason to.
Oh, okay. I feel like she's giving us reason to, but that's fine.
Joe Manchin is Joe Manchin is more interesting, I think, in his opposition, in that he's been much more active as sort of jockeying the Manchin Sinema position. He's told leadership earlier this summer that he would support the hard infrastructure bill, the Jobs Act, but for the reconciliation bill, he had a hard cap of $1.5 trillion in spending. That's a big cut. It's almost less than half. He also has certain provisions that I think are really important that, as of right now, I think are getting underreported, which is the insistence that the clean energy component of any reconciliation bill, the spending itself, is what we talked about earlier, is at the sole discretion of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, of which he is the chair. And that empowers him very strongly to support his constituents in West Virginia that are very much pro coal, natural gas, things of that nature, because his committee will be the committee through which the $200 billion for, anything that could be a Green New Deal will have to get approval through. So, and I think that's a very important piece. That's probably a sticking point for him. I don't know what Sinema gets out of it exactly, but these things I think are so there's people. So there are lots of sides, right? People who are opposed because it's not good enough. People who are opposed because it might be too good on certain things.
Right.
I think what's interesting though is that the assumed cohesion that the Democrats thought they had going in could create some new alignments with Republicans, because I think as we're seeing, there's some Democrats trying to whip some Republican votes to make up for the votes that they may lose from the progressives. I don't know. That doesn't seem likely to me. But assuming that they do, right, that's interesting because those Republicans are going to want something in return, either in this spending bill, maybe in terms of earmarks for their district, or, watering down certain proposals that are very important to them. So, a lot of this is horse trading. The progressives, I think, are standing strong, but there's also a downside of, well, does that open up some opportunities for people we disagree with to maybe get something that we might wish that we didn't trade off later? Lots of same contention with folks like Sinema and Manchin, who are fighting for certain things that may end up, boxing them out later.
Yeah, I mean, if I can be honest, I think presumed cohesion has been the theme of the issues with this administration. And again, we'll get to that later, but that appears to be a very, very regular perspective. And again, I don't want to take up too much time, but last bit on it. How does this bill impact, everyday people, right? I know that there's a lot of conversation, even in this conversation, about labor unions and special interests and what it means here in Washington. But if I'm someone who's not particularly invested in any of those, what does this look like for me?
So I think if you separating the two for the Jobs Act, just hard infrastructure, I think what it means for you, good paying jobs. I think, and that's very important. This is a jobs bill as much as anything else. A lot of these positions are manufacturing, engineering, technical jobs that require union labor. They're going to employ a lot of Americans with jobs paying, 2 or 3 times minimum wage with union protections. So that's an immediate benefit. We're talking about development in your community. As I mentioned before, certain things are racial justice and equity programs, like reconnecting Black communities into major transportation hubs where they've been, denied for decades. Remediating that could be huge and has untold economic benefits for disadvantaged communities, Black communities, Latino communities, things like that. I think if you're talking about, I would say, clean energy infrastructure and environmental cleanup is also something that I think you'll feel immediately as an average American. More EV charging stations, more electric school buses for your kids. You'll see those. Cleanup of oil wells and abandoned mines, things that are blights on the community. That type of stuff you'll see benefits from, and even sort of ambient benefits like just cleaner air to breathe, stuff like that. So I think all of that's very important for the hard infrastructure bill. I think for the softer reconciliation bill, I mean, that has the really juicy stuff for people, right? That's the child tax credit. That's your tax cut if you're making, less than $500,000. That's free community college. Things like that that's the direct benefit bill to most Americans. But I mean, both provide, I think, I don't want to understate, like, one is more for people and one not. Both are giving direct benefits to communities that you should care about. So the average American should want both of these to pass.
Makes sense. And kind of as our final word on this, if you were to give the administration a grade, particularly on this bill, what do we give them?
Okay, so if we're talking about infrastructure itself, I think that you can give, as a whole package, you can probably give both bills together a solid B to a B+. I think you're separating the bills out. I think the straight up jobs bill, probably a B- to a C. It's just by the books, absolutely what you need to move the country forward. I think if you're talking separately, that reconciliation package, given what it addresses, and your political leanings may differ, solid A- B+ in terms of hitting what needs to be hit. Details to come. Put together, you average a B to B-.
Okay.
If you're asking about the administration as a whole, there are other issues that really come into play here. So I'm going to say a solid C. And I think I'm being pretty.
I think you're grading on a curve.
I'm gonna treat them like a freshman, right? It's their first year.
Not a freshman.
For a freshman, you get a freshman C. I might judge you differently.
Not Joe Biden being treated like a freshman after 40 years in Washington, but okay. That makes sense. Jarrell, we've enjoyed you as always. Thank you so much for coming on. In the event people want to reach out to you, what's the best way they do that?
I'm on Twitter at Jarrell Cook, JARRELLCOOK.
Okay. Good to see you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Okay, as we transition from our infrastructure conversation, I want to highlight another major issue for this administration so far, which has been immigration. There's been quite a lot of issues with immigration, and ironically, we are talking about the Mexican border, which is common in our immigration conversation. However, we're not necessarily talking about Mexicans, right? And so I think part of what we have the Reverend Elisa Aldafe coming to us about is what exactly is going on at our southern border and what makes it a little different than our typical conversations on immigration. So, Elisa.
Hi.
Always good to see you.
Good to see you too. Congratulations on 1 year of podcasting.
Woo-woo! Thank you, thank you. But keeping that in mind, so today we're talking about immigration. With you, we're talking about immigration. So let's take it from the top. What is happening at the Mexican border right now, particularly with Haitians?
Yeah, so last week, we saw images and videos going around social media and the news, images of Haitian asylum seekers and immigrants coming to seek asylum and to seek refuge in the States along the southern border. And they were met with violence. Literally, the Border Patrol chose violence in those moments. And so we had images of Haitian image bearers of God being chased away and whipped using whips and other forces of violence against them by merely only coming to seek safety and refuge after some tumultuous events that happened in Haiti. Of course, their previous president had just been assassinated. They just had a huge earthquake, and things are not great right now. And so, as one can imagine, they are seeking safe places to take their families, like anyone would want to. And so, the deal there with that is they were not met with love and welcome, and two, there are laws in place for people who are seeking asylum who can come and say, I'm seeking asylum, and they are supposed to be welcomed and allowed in. However, those rules apparently did not apply. And I think it is quite often when we see images of the border in South Texas, we often think particularly Mexican or people from Central and South America. And we often forget that people are coming from all over the world to try to come in through this border. And so last week we saw many Haitian siblings trying to do this, and it was actually quite a horrific scene. And as of about 4 days ago, many of them were taken back flown back to Haiti, mm-hmm. and others are now in Colombia and border cities, essentially making a bottleneck there of many Haitian folks trying to find another way to come in. And it's funny because several interviews done with Haitian immigrants, they've said, we thought that because of the new administration and because of new policy thinking, there was a new president, they could try to come and they could try to cross, and that's not the case.
It is not the case, and I want to double down on the point that you made, that in order to apply for asylum, you have to physically be present in the United States. I think there's a lot of conversation about, well, they came illegally, there's another way to come. In order to apply for asylum, you have to physically arrive. And so it's not a situation where because they're here that makes it different. That's actually exactly what the program and protocol is for, and I just want to make that abundantly clear. Exactly. But speaking of coming, right, we had this issue with Vice President Harris, who made some particular comments in Guatemala where the words she used were "don't come." And so I guess one, you talked about the fact that they thought this administration would be different, but can we talk about what the issue with that message, particularly in Guatemala?
Yeah, so and I think you summed it up perfectly back in June when, you gave it a few days, and, I usually look to you for like, what's the take here? Maybe I'm not a political, I'm not a politico. I don't really understand these things. And I have found that oftentimes you just have to take them for their word and what they're saying. And, you summed it up pretty well in June, and essentially, they showed us who they really are. And it felt like a very strategic insult to injury. And like you mentioned, and I think a big comment you made in June was, there's something to be said with how they position Vice President Harris to be the one to make this message, who is herself a child of immigrants. Mm-hmm. To say to Central America, a region of the world that the United States has historically meddled in and created issues for people to come to us, mm-hmm. and tell them from a microphone, do not come. Mm-hmm. I think that essentially showed us that nothing was going to change. Yeah. And so when I saw those images last week, my only thought was, they really meant it. They really meant don't come.
Yeah. I think that's a great through needle on this, right? I think what's frustrating to see is, one, if we're going to even just take it at its face, ignoring who she is as a person, to say don't come, outside of being, I think, unnecessarily cruel, I think it's intentionally dense and unhelpful.
Yeah.
Right. This is not a situation where people are showing up to go on vacation. This is not a situation where there was, confusion or, they are intentionally fleeing an unsafe situation. And like, trust me, most people would rather be safe and secure economically and physically where they are. And so to say don't come as though like they had never considered that, I just thought was so egregious. And then to follow that up with the particular issue we're seeing at the border now with Haitians, when we understand that President Biden recently invoked TPS, temporary protected status, for the Haitians that are currently residing here because of, I believe it was an earthquake that recently decimated Haiti. And so, again, when we look back, we know that Haiti has had a lot of natural issues and political issues that have led to be fleeing at different times. And so to see them be greeted at the border with this type of animosity, I thought was particularly egregious. I have one more question for you, although I do think that we know, like, with the rhetoric of the previous administration being so intentional on Latinx immigrants, right? And we're seeing now, how do we feel now, I guess, even about the rhetoric of this administration and its treatment of immigrants from what we've seen so far?
I don't think anything has really changed. I think it is the same policies, just a different primary color. And with the boldness that the Trump administration moved on DACA, on immigration, on Title 42, on TPS, I don't see that in the Biden administration on immigration. And I am so tired of Democrats not acting in the boldness that the previous administration did. And we say it's under the guise of bipartisanship, but that is fodder, that is just unuseful. And I think we mentioned before, Biden is working under this old concept of what it means to do business as usual in Washington. And I think that is out the window. You were absolutely right. And that we don't need that. We need immediate and direct action on immigration. And I haven't seen that. What I've seen is more of the same thing. What I've seen with the administration is them trying to continue with Title 42, which was a racist policy to begin with. For those who don't know, it was essentially allowing the removal of people who are trying to cross with the understanding if they have come from a country that has a communicable disease, they can be immediately removed. Let's talk about the racism in that policy. And the Biden administration is out here trying to fight the removal of it. And so tell me how stuff has changed. I don't see it. And so, between that and trying to create another private prison on Guantanamo Bay for immigrants, not feeling great. And so I think there needs to be more done.
Absolutely. I also just want to take a moment to say, with the irony of trying to I guess, demonize or otherize another country for having an issue with communicable disease, as though we haven't been a bastion for COVID for the last year and a half. The white supremacy is thick on this one, but okay. While we're here, though, as you're parting with us, what grade would you give this administration on the way that they've handled immigration?
I would give them a C, a staunch C.
Okay.
I was trying to write my grade down. I have it written several times and scratched out here. Nothing has changed. And, you really want, I think at the bare minimum, right, you want some type of change, and you for that you get a C+ or a B-, but I am not seeing that. So I'm going to stick with a C.
Okay. We heard it from Reverend Elisa Aldafe. In the event they want to follow up with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can contact me on Twitter or interact with me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is AA Aldafe on the Bird app. So look forward to interacting.
It's good to see you, Elisa.
Good to see you too, Lauren.
Have a good one.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Okay. So we've done infrastructure, we've done immigration. I want to take a moment to talk about reproductive rights. So, unfortunately, with the same theme of Texas, we've got an issue with reproductive rights as well. So recently, Governor Greg Abbott, you might know him from, I don't know, a blizzard hitting his state and him doing nothing about it, or trying to invoke a ban on mask mandates, or from getting the host of other things that he has done in Texas that have been egregious to my home state, that have been disrespectful to all communities. He is up for re-election next year, and my current thought is that his intention is to kill as many people as possible and then make sure that the ones that are left cannot vote. It's been really, really bad, but most recently he did a 6-week abortion ban. And what that means is that in the event you find out that you are with child and are further along than 6 weeks, you are not allowed to terminate. The reason that this is a problem is because many, many people do not find out they are pregnant that early. There are a lot of signs with a person's body when they find out that they're pregnant, and to effectively expect that to happen in the first 6 weeks is very, very early. And it's a medical issue. The idea that by your first doctor's appointment, you're unable to pursue all your options is very much a problem. And so President Biden insisted throughout the campaign that he was invested in Roe v. Wade, that he would not at all be disrupting a woman's right to choose. And these bills have been popping up across the country. And so his Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has reached out and is suing, the Justice Department is suing Texas for this abortion ban. And we will see what comes of that. This is the first attempt that they've made in order to do that, particularly around choice. And we will see what comes of it. That's still pending. But I did want to go ahead and take a moment to say that on reproductive rights right now, we're going to go ahead and give this administration a B, primarily because there's an attempt made. We haven't seen what follows through on it. But right now, it's abundantly clear that reproductive rights are under attack, and that the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice are where that will be decided. Keeping that in mind, though, I would like to go ahead and talk about party unity. So if we remember during the primary season, President Biden was effectively, he was off to a shaky start initially. He didn't win Iowa or New Hampshire. It is assumed that Representative Clyburn's endorsement of him in South Carolina was his saving grace, along with older Black voters, and that continued to a sweep across the South, which therein gave him the nomination. And so he came into a fairly fractured party. There was a strong progressive wing that thought this was an opportunity to make real change. And then there were moderates who were more invested in previous administration, Obama administration style tactics, and thought that Trump was a fluke. We all know, as we agreed today, that President Biden has been around Washington for a very long time. And so he came in with a wealth of knowledge about the office and about how Washington worked in a way that I think that many people thought was going to be promising for him. And so we will see what is going on there with Will Brummett. Will is one of my favorite people to talk politics with. You'll also remember him from season 1 when he broke down one of the presidential debates with us. Hi, Will.
Hey, Lauren. Happy 1 year. Happy birthday, anniversary.
All the things. I'm accepting all the congratulations.
It's also National Podcast Day.
So it is
officially my favorite podcast. There you go.
Oh,
put that on Twitter.
That means a lot. Thank you.
Thing. You're welcome.
But let's take it from the top. So you and I have been having this conversation very much off camera, but like, how are Democrats of different stripes feeling about this administration?
Yeah. So Lauren, you're from the South. I'm from the South. And you, I'm sure, have gone to like a family reunion before. And you know, when you go under those family reunions, you meet in those like church halls, those big ass tents outside and then cook out. And then you go because you're under the notion that you're all related somehow. But then just like those other cousins, you're like, how the hell am I related to them? Or do we have the same last name? I think that's the best metaphor I can give to you for like what the Democratic Party is that we are Democrats by name. But our tent, I think at the very least, is quite fractured, depending on who you're asking and what viewpoint you're looking at. And I know there's a lot of them. Yeah, so I would say right now, party unity is not. I don't think Nancy Pelosi and Joe Manchin are going out on his boat this weekend, to enjoy the fall weather. I think they're probably doing their own separate thing. Who knows?
I believe that. I believe that invitation was not extended. And we also saw recently that Andrew Yang, who, as some people remember, was a presidential candidate in 2020 and recently launched a bid for mayor that did not really come to anything. He is most recently decided to launch a third party, or is threatening to launch a third party. And so what is that about, and does that matter at all here?
Yeah, so I would, I've never been a Yang Gang fan. I thought it was a cute hashtag, but I never was. But to his credit, the Universal Basic Income (UBI) method did show up. It's sort of like the American Rescue Plan and other features. So he did shift the conversation. But really, I think ultimately this is a book thing. His book is called Forward. His new party is going to be called Forward Together. Okay. But if you look at the platform, you look at some of the things that he's for universal basic income, which again, sort of a little bit more mainstream than it was. Good for him. But he talks about like human-centered capitalism, fact-based governance, a lot of other sort of vague terminology that sounds nice, but really isn't as fully established in himself. I think the two most interesting things he mentioned to me were, one, having open primaries and promoting for open primaries to allow anyone to sort of challenge regardless of party. And then second was the ranked choice voting, which we saw did not work out well for him in New York, but almost worked out for his second choice, which was candidate Catherine Garcia almost won through ranked choice voting with the New York mayor election. So I don't think Andrew Yang, like, to me, it's sort of like the kid in high school who keeps talking up himself and is like, I'm going to do a backflip. I'm going to do a backflip. But he's never done one. Andrew Yang's never gotten close. He's never gotten close. He made some noise. He stood around longer than we thought in the presidential primary. He stood around and had a lot of momentum early on in the New York City mayor's race, but he faded out. So at the very least, I think maybe this is a conversation shifter, but I think ultimately this is Andrew Yang looking to hopefully sell some books. Now, the third party idea, though, may be really interesting depending on what happens coming up, like Jarrell mentioned earlier, with this sort of reconciliation bill and then also this bipartisan infrastructure bill, because I don't think Democrats are maybe not willing to stay together. Who knows? And I'm also not convinced. I know that we've talked about that maybe Joe Manchin's got something bigger up his sleeve for his own third-party run in 2024. Who knows?
Who knows? And speaking of Manchin, we know that Manchin and Sinema have been such huge, I guess, players that for people who did not pay attention to politics, these were not people that you knew. The senator from West Virginia, the senator from Arizona. And so to see them show up as such major players especially in Sinema's case, without too much seniority. What do we make of that, particularly in a unified party perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of depends again, right, who you ask. So on one hand, I was talking to, I think, my mom the other day. She's like, do you know there's a Democrat in West Virginia who was elected? Like, a lot of people didn't know who like Joe Manchin really was, or the fact that he's a Democrat, partially because he doesn't really act like one. But then for Kyrsten Sinema, I think it's interesting because she sort of has played this weird, quirky independent streak a lot. But like you said, she's sort of a relatively, she is technically the senior senator from Arizona right now, but she's relatively junior in her time in the Senate. And she's playing things very close to the chest. She doesn't really talk a lot to the media and do a lot of sort of open door politicking. But she definitely has some really weird conservative streaks. But what's interesting is that the Biden administration really has sort of let Senator Sinema and also Senator Manchin sort of run their agenda. Like they have let two people run the Democratic Party really relatively these last few months. And so I think what's interesting is I think the other senators have to be getting frustrated. I know that the Progressive House Caucus is incredibly frustrated with the Senate side. I know other senators have to be looking at them being like, who are you? I mean, if I'm Dick Durbin or if I'm, the former sheriff, if I'm any other Democratic senators looking like, what are you doing holding this up? But at the same time, if you look at their poll numbers, Sinema is +7 in her favorable versus unfavorable in Arizona.
Wow.
She's higher than Senator Mark Kelly, who just got elected on a pretty good landslide.
And he's former Representative Giffords' husband.
Exactly. And he's a pretty popular figure, not controversial. Manchin, I just checked as well in a recent poll, by the local Gazette newspaper is 40-40. He's tied at 40-40 approval, 40-40 disapproval. Well, now 44 is not high. It's not for what he usually typically likes to be in his state, but he's not necessarily in threat either. So I think what you have going on, which is interesting, is that you have two senators who know their state constituents that actually aren't representative of, again, the big tent party. They're the awkward cousins. And they know they're awkward, but they know that they're going to have their seat. And I think what's going to happen is ultimately the Biden administration and Joe Biden has got to sort of take the authority and say, look, we've got to get one of these things done, because if the Biden administration doesn't deliver on the bipartisan infrastructure package or the Build Back Better plan, and doesn't deliver on both, what do they have to show for all the hard work that progressives did in organizing? What do they have to show for flipping Georgia? What do they have to show for turning out record numbers of youth vote? What do they have to show for turning out record numbers of black vote when Joe Biden's whole candidacy was drowning in South Carolina? So if all they say is that we had the American Rescue Plan, like that was it? I mean, what else is it? He doesn't have a foreign policy accomplishment to point to. He doesn't have another domestic agenda accomplishment to point to. And even today, one of the things that I was most interested in was, after Afghanistan, everyone was really, the media especially, like his poll numbers are going to tank. And they did tank. He was about 43%. But as of today, the NPR and Marist did a combined poll, and he moved back up. So now he's at 45, I think the percentage is approval, 46 is disapproval. So he's pretty close. But Lawrence, his whole administration has been about how people have been feeling about the pandemic. And the Biden administration right now has currently, I think it's something like, it was 36% of people say they are more stressed now than they were a year and a half ago.
Wow.
And 41% say they're about as stressed as they were. So irregardless of what the numbers look like in terms of the Delta variant of the COVID vaccine, how people feel about it, if the Biden administration can't deliver on a meaningful policy agenda of what Democrats actually stand for, and people feel anxious or just as anxious as they did, the midterms are going to be real rough for Democrats. And our tent's going to get real small real quick, because some people are going to be kicked out and going home. So
I completely agree with you. I definitely think the midterms is where everybody's mind should be. One, historically, Democrats don't do well in midterms anyway. And I think that particularly a lot of people were uneasy about Biden coming in. I mean, as I brought out originally, it felt like those first weeks of January, we were like on the precipice of like some civil unrest, some civil war type energy. And so I think there was this immediate cohesion just for like sheer safety and security.
Yeah.
That has definitely dissipated, is not at all there now. And so to see how you're going to govern under that type of pressure, right, is very interesting as far as COVID goes. If I'm honest, I'm going to go ahead and say it. I don't think pandemic of the unvaccinated is catchy. I don't think it makes people feel better. I don't think it is even effectively shaming people who haven't gotten vaccinated. I think it's overall an ineffective message, and they should pick something else. And so I'm not surprised to see the numbers about COVID, because again, if I'm unvaccinated, I'm getting a message of consistent shame. And if I am vaccinated, I'm getting, well, you actually, you're not all the way safe. And so what is the I guess, incentive there? But in the interest of time, and because we know this conversation can be had forever, Will, if you had to give this administration a grade on party unity right now, what do you give them?
All right, so because we are technically filming this live on September 30th, technically the House and the Senate are talking right now. This is what I'm going to do.
Okay.
I'm going to give the Biden administration and party unity, I'm going to give them currently, just right now, I'm going to give them an incomplete. What happened is Joe Biden made the freshman mistake of it's a group project. We did a group project, and he got Nancy, his smartest student, to do the research, and she designed and is leading a good part. And he got some other people. He got Chuck Schumer, who's just sort of filling his space. But he gave the closing to Joe freaking Manchin, and they haven't shown up yet. So we don't know if they're going to show up for the presentation, and we don't know if they're showing up for the final. So all he's done, bare minimum, is that he's given enough of a rescue plan to pass. So I'm going to say, if nothing happens, D minus.
Okay.
Joey would disappoint his mom, as President Biden likes to say all the time. if Sinema and Manchin show up and they get off both the jobs plan through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then some form between 1.5 to maybe 3.5 trillion dollars in the reconciliation, then I think we're looking at like an A- B+. But at the end of the day, right now I'm gonna say incomplete, and I'm leaning towards the D. I think sadly it's going to be D for Democrats, which is the most
D for Democrats.
Yeah.
So an incomplete or a D, neither of which put us on the dean's list or have us graduating summa cum laude. We are
no.
floating out here.
We're floating. But Joe Biden wasn't a great student either anyway in his undergrad. So, and he still became president. So, if I've learned anything, you can't underestimate Joe Biden, but you also can't have too much hope in Joe Biden. So that's where it is.
This is a mess. Well, in the event people want to reach out to you, what's the best way they do that?
Yes, I personally like snail mail, but I'm not going to give you my address because this is live and on the web. So you can reach me on Twitter as well at W Brummett. I'm on Twitter, so love to talk there.
All right, love talking to you. Have a good one.
See you, Lauren. Bye.
Okay, so that's how we're currently doing on Party Unity. If we remember for these candidates in particular, as in Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden, there was a real concern around criminal justice, particularly with Harris's background as a prosecutor and Biden's background with the crime bill. And last summer felt like a real awakening on criminal justice in so many different areas. And so what does it mean to have these candidates in office right now? And we are currently grappling with that. And so no one better to talk to us about that than the Fines and Fees Director of New York, my good friend, someone I always love having over personally and on this particular program, Antonia Jeffrey. Hi, Antonia.
Hey, Lauren.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I've been listening to the conversation and I got a lot to say.
Ooh, okay, let us go ahead and get into it. So there was a lot of concern about these two individuals on criminal justice. What do we think so far?
So the concern was rightful in that I think with Joe Manchin, I had hesitation from the moment that I realized how much he was praising and applauding the First Step Act. When Trump was putting that into place, doing the negotiations for it. As you might recall, he has a number of bills that were included in there. And pretty much when the final proposal came, he was kind of like, I applaud President Trump for yada, yada, yada. I already knew we were going down the wrong path because the First Step Act is so minimal in actual reform that it was hard for me to understand how anyone was able to tout this as being substantial criminal justice reform when there weren't many changes made. There were some things done on the federal level that helps federal prisons, but there's very little meat on policing. There's very little meat on the private prison industry. And then also just in general, decarceration. So I was already worried from then. I became worried more as I realized that these two senators would be an obstacle in trying to pass more substantial reform. That really bothered me. The unwillingness, even after a year of unrest and an awakening that it seems like not only the entire country, but the entire world had, that they were not excited about the possibility of decarceration, about doing policing differently. So yeah, it's not looking good for them. And it's not looking good for the Democrats in general.
Okay. So what needs to be done? Like, what are the changes and reforms you'd like to see?
Well, first, I'd like to see a proposal that is very explicitly about reducing the size of the carceral system at all levels, federal, state, and local jails, because we see across the board with the private prison industry and how much autonomy they have over the system, that there's very little that we can do to stop that, especially locally. I work statewide, and there's so little that we can do to stop the private prison industry. So I'd like to see more on that. Also, substantial policing changes that I think are present in the current George Floyd package. That's what these two senators are blocking right now. There's substantial changes to policing practices to lower gun violence, but we're also in this unique time period where places like my home state of New York is experiencing increase in gun violence, and using that as an excuse to kind of like not act to do these things dealing with criminal justice reform. But I think that if we don't do it now, when we have the opportunity to do it, we will go back to where we were when Joe Biden introduced the crime bill. We will go back there. We will begin to criminalize communities of color, Black and brown youth. We're already finding excuses to do it. And it's alarming.
Gotcha. So you're like, first we just need to make the whole thing overall smaller. Like we cannot continue operating with the prison system this large.
Yeah, we need to change. There was some sentencing reform in the First Step Act, but it didn't go nearly as far enough to ensure that people are not being criminalized for not being for things that are poverty related, mental health related, drug misuse related, and only being used for actual public safety. And if we think about reforming the justice system in that way, we already shrink it by more than half, because many people are serving overly long sentences for minor infractions, for minor violations, doing too much time with the current laws that came from the crime bill, like the 3 strikes law, mandatory minimum sentences. We have to reverse all of that. So it's a big feat. But I think that's where we have to start. We have to go deep. We cannot play small. And that's what I'm worried about with the current makeup of the Senate, because they're playing really small.
So when you say playing small, tell us more. What do you mean?
Sorry, I had to plug in my laptop. I mean that they're trying to do like incremental change instead of big systemic changes. We see specifically at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, I am helping to support a bill that would substantially change the way that local governments operate in terms of where they seek to get funding, because we want to really get in and cut any possibility of policing for profit, extracting wealth from low income and Black and brown communities. And that means that we have to look for a different revenue source, because a lot of local governments are depending on the revenue that they take from criminalizing communities to fund their local governments. And we can't do that anymore. So I think when I say that they're playing small, I really mean that they're looking to do very surface level things, very symbolic things. Like, I guess it is symbolic that there are new bail laws, but unless people don't backtrack and allow the bail laws to do what they are intended to do, we won't know if it can actually work. Or doing small things like granting clemencies. And it does matter. It does matter. But if that's all you're doing for criminal justice reform, you are finding people where they are after they've already experienced harm for whatever amount of years, instead of doing the things that will actually rehabilitate and actually shrink the system. So it's a matter of where we look for reform, which has to be before people ever actually interact with the criminal legal system.
I think that's really important to talk about, like before they even interact. Because, you know, I serve on Voices for a Second Chance here in DC, and we work with people after they've been released. And again, most of the issues start before they even went in. And so you only show up I guess like for the jail or for the removal, like we got to start prior to that. Also noting that like specifically for New York, I know that a major I guess awakening for a lot of people about what happens in prison, and particularly wrongful imprisonment, was the Central Park, well, the Exonerated Five case, which came out of New York. And I know that recently a lot of attention has been paid to Rikers in New York as well, as being a place where people that needs to be reformed, closed down. Kalief Browder was also held at Rikers. So just being in New York as a place where it can feel like a lot of attention is paid to the criminal justice system. What is it like doing work there, particularly around with fines and fees justice?
It's tough. It's tough. And to go back to talking about Rikers for a bit, Rikers is getting a lot of attention now, but the advocates who have been fighting for Rikers to be closed down have been at this for many, many, many years. The conditions have been terrible. This is not anything new. Even before Kalief Browder ever entered there. And when I think about the bail laws, which lots of folks are trying to roll back, a lot of the progressive changes that we made in 2019, when I think about that, I think about the fact that many people, Rikers is a jail. So most people who are there have not yet been convicted of anything. They're being held pretrial. Dealing with those types of conditions, what that can do to you mentally, what it can do to you physically, emotionally, financially, is huge. And whether you're able to get out of that system or not, you sometimes face the impact of that. And for my line of work with fines and fees, that impact is financial. It's debt. It's the amount of debt that you have to get boggled down with and enter this cycle that you just cannot leave. Mm-hmm. Sometimes can re-incarcerate people for their inability to pay.
Yep.
And that's how they have stocked these prisons. There's been a commitment and a call for some reform in Rikers. Personally, I think Rikers should be shut down. There's a split even amongst the people who understand that what's going on in Rikers is inhumane. People who think that Rikers should be shut down and then borough-based jails should be built in their places. People who think that Rikers should just be shut down, of which I am a part of that group. And then people who think that you should fix Rikers. No, don't fix Rikers. Don't fix Rikers. I was watching a report earlier today that was talking about some of the people who were at Rikers pre-trial went back to do some volunteering and fixing things up. And they were saying like, yeah, we don't want to do this, but it's also a part of like what they plead down to, like some. Yeah, exactly. I think it just perpetuates this cycle. It's a vicious cycle. It's a cycle of debt, of poverty, of punishment, unduly to people who don't deserve it. Yeah, Rikers is terrible. And I can imagine that Rikers is a huge deal because so many, I guess, national news has happened there with cases, but these jails are mostly in rural areas. And so Rikers is a prominent example of things that are happening all across the country in very small places, in jails where people have not actually been convicted, are being held pre-trial and being treated inhumanely.
I think you said it all. So what would you give this administration in regards to criminal justice? What grade would you give them?
Well, before I give a grade, I would like to say that I have been reviewing the campaign promises that Joe Biden had on criminal justice and matching them up with his actions and his intentions and like the plans that I see formulating. I think that a lot of it has been a part of the conversation, but nothing has really come to fruition. And I'm unsure if that's because of what's happening in Congress,
Right.
or if it's because of just like lack of willingness to do so. But people are languishing, and you made a promise. You made a number of promises around policing that have not been done, around the way that people who are undocumented interact with the criminal legal system, and around sentencing, around fines and fees. The issues that I work on here in New York State are a part of that agenda, and a lot of it hasn't been fulfilled. Some of it has come into conversation, but I'm not really seeing any action. So I'm gonna have to give, right now we're at like a C-. And the only reason why we're even in the C stage is because of some of the agenda setting that I'm seeing. But no real action doesn't get above like a C.
That's real. That's real. Antonia, first of all, I would like to point out that you were literally one of my first guests. You were on the first episode.
Yes, and congratulations. I'm so proud of you. I don't understand. I don't understand how you don't run out of things to talk about, but you don't.
Because the truth is, it's always something to talk. It's really, in theory, I should like to run out of things to talk about, but unfortunately, in America, there's always things to talk about. But in the event people want to talk to you and keep this conversation going, what's the best way they do that?
Okay, so the best way to keep in contact with me would be Twitter. Okay. I don't talk that much on there anymore because hot takes are literally killing me slowly. But you can find me at Miss Antonia, ANTONYA on Twitter, or you can email me at ajeffrey@ffjc.us. Can I say one more thing? I believe that it is possible with the right makeup in Congress, which means that midterms, which I see, like I have like a premonition that it's going to go kind of like 2010 midterms, and I'm scared of that. But if we don't get like a Tea Party like makeup in 2022, with the right makeup in Congress, we can make a lot of progress on criminal justice reform. The one thing that I will say to Joe Biden's merit is that there is effort being put forth in communicating with the organizations and the advocates that want to do the work. We haven't gotten quite to where we need to be yet. So that's why I'm not giving it a failing grade, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Okay. That makes sense. It's good to see you, Antonia, and tell your mom I said happy birthday.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so actually we are out of time. What we did not get to today is voting rights. We didn't get to COVID. We didn't get to misinformation and disinformation. We didn't get to the future of running for office with young people, all of which I get to cover on this season. I'm so excited to be with you. As always, if you ever need to reach out to me, you can find me at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram. And if you're looking for the show, you can find us at Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you so much for being here for our premiere, and I look forward to seeing you soon.